Ahoy, and welcome in to another mind expanding episode of Not Allowed to Die, your podcast about mental health, where I, Dan Magler, social worker and life enthusiast, answer your questions about mental health and talk about dilemmas that I'm seeing in my practice as a school social worker and as a therapist in private practice. Alongside me, as always, is Mariska, the three-toothed Patterdale Terrier. And Mariska was busily scratching away on her dog bed that lies next to me because we were out in the cold and her paws were hurting. I actually had to carry her home at the end of the walk. And we know the best way to help Mariska's paws is to rate, review, and follow the podcast. And we know if you want her paws to feel better, she needs 5 stars and she needs a comment. So if you want to help Mariska with the 5 stars, then go ahead and do that. In addition, we are always bringing this podcast to you in part to raise awareness for Paws for Patrick, bringing the love of animals to the people who need it the most. If you know a young person who has a mental health difficulty who could benefit from an emotional support animal, please go to pawsforpatrick.org. Tonight, I'm incredibly excited because selfishly, one of the reasons why I do this podcast is to learn from interesting people. And our guest tonight is exactly the kind of person that I want to have on to share things with you because I learned so much from him in his podcast. Nathan is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice and co-host of Altered States of Context, a podcast about psychedelics, science, and psychotherapy. He also practices regenerative ranching and writes a newsletter, Trippin' with Nate, from his family farm in rural West Central Illinois. He's also a frequent guest and occasional host for the Doomer Optimism podcast, a collective project focusing on finding meaning and productively adapting to the ecological and cultural challenges of our current time and place. I really genuinely am a fan of Nate's podcast. So, Nate, thank you so much for coming on tonight. And if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your journey and how you got into this healing along with psychedelics.
Well, great. Thanks for having me on, and it was really fun to hear from you and for you to reach out and invite me. And we went to undergrad together
Mm-hmm.
many years ago. Many years ago, we were both at the same Illinois Wesleyan University, and also we lived in the same fraternity house for a year.
Yep.
So yeah, and it's been a long time. It's been a long time, so it was really fun to hear from you, and I'm happy to come on. Um, yeah, and I guess that if we want to talk about kind of the topic today, what I talk about in my podcast, is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, psychedelics generally, and kind of my interest in those goes all the way back to that time. Um, which you remember. And I think Dan had a front row seat at my antics in college, which were antics for sure. I was, a stereotype in sort of like the old school vein, I guess, if you've seen that movie, of overindulgence and, too much drinking, too much wildness, taking the college life too far. Um, and in that I'd kind of lost myself a bit, um and was just kind of saying yes to whatever. And I remember mushrooms. It was like it was before like my freshman year, and then again my sophomore year. I took these, and I had these experiences on those of like, because I took them to just get messed up, just like anything else. It's like, well, sure, that sounds like fun. I was just in party mode. And I took them and had this really surprising experience of, well, that was super fun and interesting, but that definitely wasn't getting fucked up. And I don't know. Sorry if
That's
that's
fine. Yeah, you can go ahead and say whatever. Yeah.
um, that's not what that is. And so it like kind of opened this question in my mind. And so I began to use psychedelics a little more often. And this funny thing happened is that the more I used psychedelics, the less I drank and the less I wanted to drink, and the less wild I became, and the more I began to study. And like, there's a really like it's a perfect correlation. You can see it in my grades. You can see it, in a lot of things. Uh, Junior year, I had stopped drinking altogether, which was something that lasted for 15 years. I didn't drink alcohol for 15 years, and it was and I will say that it was a direct result of my experience on psychedelics. I had a series of experiences in which I kind of had these broad perspective shifts of seeing myself as I had been and how I had been behaving, and seeing kind of the way that the kind of life that that led to, and seeing kind of like really clearly the people who were and would be disappointed in that, and a very clear sense of what was important and how I wanted to live, and how incompatible living the way I had been was with that. It was just clear. It was clear as a bell. And, these experiences that I can only describe as spiritual, in which I felt a part of something larger. I didn't feel separate. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel alone. And all of these things kind of came together for me to put my life on a drastically different track. And so since then, I've always kind of referred to it as feeling sort of like integrity bound to share my experiences of that, and to be honest about it. Even though 25 years ago it was not nearly as acceptable.
Hmm.
Even 10 years ago. And in 10 years ago, I was a professional in professional settings, and I still talked about psychedelics, even though at the time people really looked at me funny and, "Oh, you shouldn't say that. You shouldn't talk like that." But I felt like I had an obligation to, because I had to be honest about what my experience, and I couldn't ever go along with the story that's been told about psychedelics. I could never, I could never kind of like sit quietly and just allow that story to be perpetuated in my presence, because it's not, it's like, well, that completely clashes with my experience in a very, very deep way. And so since then, I've sort of been an advocate and outspoken about it, and have just been very curious about that transformation that happened in me, and about, learning more about, um, basically what it is to be a person. That led me down the path of becoming a therapist, because that's just a wonderful way to be engaged with people, and to learn about people, and to learn, um, people's stories, and just the depth and richness of what it is to be a human. Um, and so that's kind of the broad overview of how I am, where I am today.
So, and I think what you and I have both experienced in using traditional therapy and encouraging people to use, take medication and whatever, I run into all the time people who are doing everything they're supposed to do, and it's just not working. And that's
Mhm.
why I am so enthusiastic about anything that we can do to say what the current state of things is not enough. I really believe that we're
Yeah.
kind of 50 years from now, we're going to look at what we're doing with just throwing medications at people that aren't really tailored to them. And we're going to say, gosh, that was like when they were bleeding people with leeches. And
Mhm.
so you've gone through a program, and if you could talk a little bit about this, to learn how to actually treat people, so you had your own experiences, both it was kind of like the chocolate and the peanut butter kind of coming together. You had your own experiences with psychedelics, and you had your own experiences learning to do mental health things. So how did those come together? To how did you begin to learn to do the treatment program, to actually be treating people effectively with this in a way that's structured?
Okay, so to clarify that too, like, I don't actually do that work. I don't provide psychedelic therapy myself. I have learned about it. I'm prepared to. I took the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, their um, MDMA training program, which was a semester long. I took that a couple years ago, and have followed this for 20 years, and been close. Just followed it really, really closely. Um, and have stayed engaged with psychedelic experiencing myself on and off since then. That isn't something I just turned off in college. Um, Not nearly the same frequency anymore, but so I don't do this. And I find when I talk about it too, a lot of times people will reach out to me and be like, "So how do I?" And I'm like, "Well, no, it's not me. I'm not. I'm not doing. I mean, not that I, again, not that I wouldn't like to, but I'm a licensed professional here, and that's just not a thing I could do.
Well, it's not
In
legal, and
yet,
certainly not legal yet, and we'll talk a
not
little bit
yet.
about more how that eventually might be changing. But,
Yeah.
but this idea though but that there are people who are doing this. So, and that the kinds of people that it's where do you think like the people who should be sort of like looking into, like if they're stuck or if wherever, like who are some of the like what are some of the misconceptions that you're, because you are kind of, I think of you as an advocate for and a person who goes out educating people about the myths and the realities of psychedelics. So wouldn't you mind sharing a little bit about like, so what are some of the myths that you like you're finding like yourself having to counteract a lot as you're talking to people?
Well, I mean, let's start just right up front with the safety question, which is a really complicated question. I remember, I'm sure because I'm talking to you, so like my mind is going way back to Wesleyan days, and I remember arguing because I would like this is at the time when I was like probably my junior year, and I was just really like people that age are. I was gung ho about it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
still very interested in psychedelics, but gung ho is the word for then. And you remember, I'm sure Eric Riggy,
Mm-hmm.
and he and I got into an argument about it, and he was like, well, yeah, that's dangerous, Nate. You shouldn't do that. It's dangerous. And I was like, it's not. And we were eating at the cafeteria or somewhere at the time. He had a hamburger. I remember that because what I said next was like, dude, my LSD is safer for me than that hamburger is for you. And and I have actually thought about that a ton, and I've thought about like, I wonder how, because there's certain things like, well, long term, if that hamburger represented a poor diet over time, there could be health consequences. Whereas, with drugs like psilocybin and LSD, the physiological um, side effects, the dangers seem to be extraordinarily low. Extraordinarily low. The chances of there basically is not a lethal dose, or the lethal dose is so high as to be practically not a lethal dose. So as far as like overdose risk, it isn't there. So um, physiologically, it's a fair. There are most psychedelics. Now, there's a bunch of different psychedelics we could break down. MDMA is a kind of a different category. It's sometimes called a psychedelic. It's sometimes called an empathogen or an entactogen. Um, it's being used especially to treat PTSD right now. Clinically, that's what it's being studied for, and seems really, really promising for that. It probably like you can use too much of that one, but the like LSD, psilocybin, as far as physically, and I'm being really careful to say physically,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's a really high degree of safety. So if you compare it to the cheeseburger, maybe. Although I'm a big advocate of red meat now because I do like red meat. So that comparison, I don't know where I stand with it anymore. But just that argument really jumped back into my mind. Um, Now the risks, and there are risks with psychedelics, are psychological in nature, or they're, and I wouldn't say that they are um, that it's super dangerous. I think that in life we do all kinds of risky things all the time, and I think that the risks aren't necessarily out of line with a lot of things that are generally accepted as common practice. But again, that's not the same thing as saying they're safe. And so I think that there is a risk of making poor decisions, poor decisions while under the influence of it. Your judgment's obviously impaired. You're also pretty vulnerable and suggestible to outside influence. So I think that also there's a risk of being taken advantage of by people around you. So putting yourself in situations in which you don't know people, in which you're kind of in unsafe situations, is probably a bad idea um, because you're very suggestible and open to influence and being taken advantage of in various ways. So I think paying attention to your setting and where you're at is always very important. And it's unclear there the risk of we should talk about the risk of psychosis, especially in
Mm-hmm.
young people. It seems there's been a lot of back and forth about this, and there's the idea that there's a small percentage of people that would have onset of psychosis, but that there's a certain percentage of people of the age, 17 to early 20s, that are going to have onset of psychosis, and so it's possible that just that was the intense event that precipitated it. But it also, if there is a strong family history, it is something to really think about, because it's not clear. That's what I would say, is it's not clear. I wouldn't go so far as to say, oh, there's no risk of that. I would not say that. But I also wouldn't say there's an extraordinary risk of that either. It's sort of a one of those where it's unknown. If there's like a family history there, um, or risk factors, or that is something to be considered, to consider as well. And then there are kind of, I guess I would say, this isn't a term, I don't think, other than I'm just making it up, is like worldview risks, um, which is also part of what can be really beneficial, but anything that has the potential to sort of shake the way that you see the world, there's risks there. There could be some beliefs or some thoughts that you question, that sort of like maybe propped up a few things that were important. And again, I think especially for like stuck patterns,
Hmm.
uh, that's exactly what we want. We want something to come in and kind of break up and help us see things differently, and break up some of those really stuck repetitive patterns. So that's good, but that's also not without risk, because again, sometimes those things hold things together in a way, and there can be sort of decompensation afterwards. So it is not like it's not a risk-free thing.
Hmm.
It can be a tremendously beneficial thing, and I think that there is uh, all kinds of accumulating evidence for that. um, and anecdotally, I mean, this is the other thing, because I've like I said, I've been open about this for 20 years, and I've met so many people, because when you're open about something, other people are drawn. Then they're like, oh yeah, met so many people, experiences that are just tremendously similar to mine. Oh man, I did, when I did LSD, I totally, stopped acting this way, or I that's when I, um, you know, um, my podcast partner, he has shared on our podcast that's how he came out, as a gay man, like that gave him the strength and the courage and the understanding to be able to do that. um and so many people I've met have just told stories about how it's had a positive impact on their life, how it's helped them grow, mentally, spiritually, as a just be a better person. So I mean, that's all anecdote, of course, but when you hear them again and again and again and again and again, it's striking. And then, of course, we now have empirical evidence to go along with that, that really supports this can be helpful to people. So I guess that's a long-winded way of addressing the misconceptions, and just the safety concern, because I think a lot of misconceptions revolve around that it's super dangerous, that you'll end up, there's all kinds of stories, like there was this guy in the 60s, and he took LSD, and he ended up thinking he was a glass of orange juice, and
Yes. Yeah. I heard that one just a couple weeks ago from one of my students.
yes, yeah, and if he laid down, he'd spill, so he could never lay down. And just stuff like that, that's like, I mean, or people jumping out of windows, which, again, some things have happened, like it's not completely safe, and you can make poor decisions while under the influence of it. So it is important, I think, to do it in settings that there is how do I want to say it exactly? Because I'm not saying you need to be in a padded room or anything. And I
Well,
think
I
actually one of
guess
the best
maybe.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say, like, if we compare it to, like, we're saying, yes, it has dangers, but if we compare it to the dangers of alcohol, then
Oh yeah.
and what
Yeah.
alcohol is doing to people on a daily basis, and we talk about bad decisions. And again, you and I, again, we go back to college, and I was talking to one of my clients of the day who's about to send her 17-year-old daughter off to college, and I said, I don't want to scare you, but I also want to be real with you, that like the chances of alcohol and sexual assault and things like that, like we take for granted that this is just the case. So not to say,
Mhm.
like, just so that we need to be aware, like, is college and alcohol always a terrible thing? No, but we do need to be aware that there are these risks, and we
Yeah.
need to go armed into this, into anything that we're
Yes.
doing, being open and aware of the risks, and then also how would we handle those, and what are the supports that people should put in place. So if a person is like, so let's say one of your clients they were committed. You weren't influencing them either way, but they were committed to go, and they were saying, I want to do this. What tips would you give them for things that they can do to make this safer and do it in a smarter? It sounds like one is, and you talk about this on your podcast about that there can, like, the ethics of the danger of people being around you who are not ethical. But like, so it sounds like one key is having really trusted people around you. Is that, would you say that, that's a starting place?
For sure, for sure. And just before I dive into that, I wanted to underline what you said because I thought you said it really well. And it's just, it's the sense of proportionality around the risks that is where where we get lost. It's, like I said, there are risks and things, but I think the public conversation, the sense of proportionality is just way off, way off. So I'm not sitting here saying there aren't risks, but I am saying that they're not the way that they have been, so many people have been socialized to believe over the past 50 years. Like, that's a myth. Not saying they're perfectly safe, but it's a sense of proportionality, and it's much more in line with. I mean, we let kids, race motocross. I mean, we let kids play football. People drink. The things like this. There's risks, but yeah, that's a great question. Like, if somebody were committed and they were, like, I'm going to do this. Tips for being safe about something that you're going to choose to do anyway, would be, like you said, echoing what I had mentioned earlier, is be around people you trust. I think especially for the first time, because I actually think one of the best settings to do it, which doesn't seem like a controlled setting at all, but like actually concerts can be a really great way because there's a focal point. But I don't know that I'd recommend somebody doing that on their first time. First time, I think doing it somewhere where you can be not around a lot of other people and around only people that you really trust. Because I think where it can get into trouble is, people can take advantage or wander out and, in the public, and then, you end up around, in a weird situation, and you start to get strange thoughts, and you're paranoid about cops, and then you run, and then you lose your bearings, and just avoid that altogether and stay somewhere where it's just calm, where things are calm, and chill, and you don't have to deal with a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of different stuff that's going to sort of overwhelm and confuse you. And then settle in, have a, comfortable setting that you want to be like. So make your setting somewhere that that's a place that I would like to chill out, some comfortable places to sit, blankets, good lighting, music. People say different things about this. I'm a huge advocate of music, especially if you're just starting to. I'm a huge advocate for music because music captures your attention, and it sounds music. Music's wonderful. I don't need, this isn't like a news flash. Music's a great thing. Music on psychedelics takes on entirely new dimension. And it helps, I think, focus and ground the trip. And it's just a beautiful thing to experience. I mean, we can be, I think, really serious and therapeutic and what we want, but part of it is just appreciating the experience of being alive. That's one of the gifts, I think, of having a psychedelic experience, and something is commonplace. You can go listen to music anywhere. You can bring it up on your phone. You can play a record. We all have access to it, and it's so beautiful, and it's enhanced for sure. Under the influence and of psychedelics, and it can really help, I think, like I mentioned, focus and ground the experience. So I would recommend that. So maybe go into it with an empty stomach to avoid sometimes people get a little bit nauseous. So if you just maybe fast after lunch, if you're going to do it in the evening, or fast all day if you're going to do it in just kind of don't eat ahead of time for a few hours, and then have maybe some really nice, if you can think of cut up fresh fruit, something kind of light and sensually interesting for sort of the backside of the trip, something to kind of come down and nourish your body with. You probably don't want a bunch of really heavy stuff, but light and kind of sensually interesting foods to kind of help you come back down. I'd say that would be ideal especially for an early trip if that's something that you had decided that you wanted to do.
Now, how about, what do you think people should like start with something more like psilocybin and graduate into something like LSD, or is it doesn't really? And I hear a lot about people doing microdosing, so I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts about microdosing, or and like so things like that, or does it not? Does it just more depend on the people and the opportunity? Would you suggest?
I think so. I personally, now you'll get really different opinions about this. Really different. To me, the only difference between LSD and psilocybin, practically speaking, obviously chemically and biologically there are, but like practically speaking, is LSD lasts a lot longer. So whereas psilocybin mushrooms is like a 4 to 8 hour trip, LSD is 8 to 12. So it's a much longer experience. So obviously plan accordingly. But the experience itself isn't. In my experience, now people will argue and fight with me about that. So I'm not going to say that I'm definitely right about that, but I don't think they're very different experientially. Um, More or less very similar. It's just a matter of timing and how much time and how much time you want to spend. So in that way, psilocybin is kind of nice because it's more of it's just a shorter thing.
So as far as like don'ts, like, or things to definitely avoid, um, again, one of the things, we were talking about earlier, like, again, for myself, I have a lot of family history of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things like that. One of my clients, who she has a lot of, she's one of those people that's stuck in like negative thought patterns, but her thought patterns are delusional in nature, where they may be about, she may feel like her teeth are growing or they're too big and she has to check, but they're almost like kind of with an OCD trait and tendency. And I would be concerned, I
Hmm.
think I would be
Hmm.
concerned for her that might exacerbate that kind of thing. So are there clients that you would say, hey, with your side of what you're dealing with, in addition, to the family history of schizophrenia, bipolar, is there anybody else that you would say, hey, based on what you're dealing with right now, I would really recommend you not doing this?
Um, hmm. That's a good question. There certainly are contraindications. Um, Namely, and even with the contraindications, it's not even like say like a family, like I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that we could learn to work with psychedelics in a way that could be beneficial to people, even with things that are contraindicated right now. But we're not at all prepared to do that.
Hmm.
So I don't. So I mean, I think it's best to treat it like, hey, let's give that a wide berth here. Um, and so I think if there was anything in any tendency towards psychosis, I mean, OCD, there's an experience there are studies being done with it around OCD right now. Um and so but it's hard too because these diagnostic, and I'm kind of going back to your comment about the state of the field, the mental health field right now. It's like diagnostic categories are kind of, I don't know, nebulous and not always that helpful, because there could be presentations that look really similar but have an extremely different ideology, and that's probably going to be really impactful. So that's one where I would kind of just, I don't, in practice, I don't recommend that anybody does them or doesn't do them. I'm
Right.
always very, so, um, yeah, and I wouldn't recommend that somebody do them, um, anyway.
No, so again, and that's I've pointed out in some other podcasts. Our job as therapists, people think it's to give advice, but it's actually the opposite of that. Our
Mhm.
job is to not give advice. It's more to
Yes.
point out the idea of like, here are the pros, here are the cons. Here's what I want you to think about, and whether or not you can be
Yeah.
safe with this. But so you're just saying like, it would
Yeah.
basically, there's not a hard and fast rule. It's more each individual, maybe their why, their circumstances, and things around it that would help you to say, hey, these are just some other things you might want to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would definitely, just do that. I would lay out just sort of what I've laid out to you, and just this is my knowledge about that. And of course, you're a autonomous person, and you'll make your choice about what you want to do with that. But this is information I think that's really important for you to have when you make that decision, and it's yours to make. Um, um, yeah, and I think that stuff I would, especially if the person had a clear tendency towards psychosis. That's something to lean hard against. Like maybe don't. But yeah.
Now, have you done any research? I know on your podcast you guys don't really talk about it as much, but like about ketamine, and because one of my coworkers, she was given ketamine for migraine treatment, and but her
Hmm.
experience was kind of she described it as more being like psychedelic in nature, where she felt like she was separated from her own perspective, and she had this like distance from herself, and she's like, I could see how a person with depression and things like that might benefit, because to the point you were talking about earlier, people who are kind of caught in a thought loop of negativity,
Hmm.
being able to get
Yeah.
that 30,000 feet away from it a little bit and just to say, hey, I can see myself in a different pattern now. So, do you have any thoughts or just about like the state of ketamine treatment or things like that?
Yeah, it's real interesting. Because it's a dissociative. It's not, actually psychedelic, but by definition, I guess. Um, but it can have, it's often lumped in with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or psychedelic treatments. And it can absolutely have that sort of effect, in its, in its powerful ability to be a dissociative. Um, Now you'll see it. It's interesting because you'll see it used in a couple different ways. And I would have some specific advice for somebody around this because you can get it because it's been studied and been FDA approved for treatment of depression. And you can get it at these clinics that basically these clinic they view it. It's viewed in this very clinical medical sense of your brain is depressed and this is a drug that has shown to be able to disrupt the pattern of depression. And it's viewed very like instrumentally as like this drug acts on your brain to fix depression. And you go in most of these clinics and you go in and you have the drugs administered in a pretty, like I said, very clinical environment. And you're kind of left alone. And then, you get a ride home and that's pretty much it. It's the mechanism of action is viewed as the drug. And I don't think that that's ideal in any way, shape, or form because my biggest sort of like the way I view, I'll just put it that way. The way I view psychedelics is that psychedelics induce a human experience, and that experience allows us to form new learning, right? Because that experience opens our perspective, and we learn from experience. We are, animals that learn from experience, and so it induces an experience that we can learn from. And learning, in my view, is the process of change. Learning is how we learn to adapt and make changes in our life. It isn't I don't view it mechanistically as like, well, this brain, your brain has this problem and this drug, knocks something loose and then you feel better. To me, that's useless. I mean, absolutely useless. But the idea of learning, we learn from experience. We get new information. We get to see things in a different way. We have a different perspective, and that allows us to shift. And then we learn things, and then we can change our behavior as a result of that. And so there are clinics that are mindful of that too, that actually facilitate the experience, not necessarily facilitate the experience, because the experience is sort of what it is. Like maybe you are left alone to have that, but like some introduction to it, some therapy or work ahead of time to prepare a person, and then afterwards to sort of integrate or make sense of that experience. Um, and like there's a place up in that area, some people I know, the Sauna Healing Collective is a place that a person could go to that uses ketamine therapy, and they use it in this therapeutic way, not in a simply medicalized way. And so I think ketamine can be great. It's but I think how it's used really matters. And these very dry, just go get your dose and leave. I'm not that much of a fan of that because I don't see that it. I don't share sort of like a lot of the assumptions behind that model at all.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of my recent guests, Eric DeRosa from Survivor to Thriver podcast, he was talking about he has in his mind this equilateral triangle of healing, and on one leg of this or aspect is Western medicine and therapy and things like that, and one is more of an Eastern thought and spiritual perspectives, and then the third is nature. And he said for himself, when those aren't all integrated, that he finds himself falling apart. And that when we're not like, especially when I hear on your podcast, people talk, what I love about you guys say is like the what we don't need to separate and be just clinical when we're thinking about using psychedelic and treatment and separate it from the spiritual, separate it from the recreational. Like these things don't have to be split apart. And you can enjoy yourself and have fun and laugh and heal. And maybe it works better that way when we're not trying to split all these things apart and just, for research studies, a lot of times they feel this need sometimes to like, okay, we need to control every single variable and make it just, medicine and science. But when we're doing that, we're maybe losing something, and about the effectiveness.
For sure, for sure. And it is one of the limitations. That's why I'm a lot more interested in the science that's being done, the research that's being done. It's trying to look at like the mechanism of action, like how is this working? Like what, like how do people think it's working? How do we think it's working? And is it working for the reasons that we think it's working? These are more interesting questions than what a lot of the research is, which is unfortunately only directed by this is how you have to do it for, for FDA approval. You have to, do the randomized controlled trial thing, which is really limited in its utility for this. Especially when you think of the question of like blinding, which is kind of hilarious. It's like, so you have two, basic blinded experiment. You have two groups. One's going to get the medicine, one isn't, but neither the researchers nor the participants know who gets the medicine and who gets the placebo. And maybe it's a placebo, like just completely inert, or maybe it's an active placebo that will have some sort of an effect. But everyone who gets the psilocybin knows good and damn well they got the psilocybin, and so do the people facilitating. So blinding is instantly broken, and there's just really no way around it. It's a limitation. That's not, and then this is often used as a criticism of psychedelic therapy. And it's like that's not a criticism of psychedelic therapy. That's a criticism of the research method that we have to use. It just doesn't work, right? But that's the system. That's how it's evaluated. So that's how it has to be used. But it's clearly blinding is just, it's going to be an issue. No one's confused by whether they got a big dose of psilocybin or a water pill. Like no one's confused about that. So there are limits in what and how we can study it, and I don't want to underemphasize too some of the, like, psychedelics are weird. Like they're weird. They operate like they are. They distort your perception. They consistently create experiences that people will later describe as, wow, that was one of the most or the most significant experiences of my life. This is an experience that people routinely say that after. And that's strange to think that a person would have a drug experience and then come away from that and not just be like, wow, that was a good time or that was a party, but that was one of the most significant experiences I've ever had. And so this is weird. They're weird.
Well, yeah. And to your point, I think of two of my clients who are both college students now, who both had, they had what they would describe as sort of sad trips. But they still both are saying there's still a place for this in my world, and they intend to do it again at some point. One person who they were with their father, and their father, they had very persistent depression, and their father took them down to Lake Michigan and said, hey, I want to just do psilocybin with you and see if that helps at all. Just like father just taking a shot in the dark and like saying like maybe this, and it didn't fix or cure or whatever, but it did change perspective. And they are like that particular experience wasn't positive. It wasn't overwhelmingly positive, but it did make me see some things differently. And I think I'm going to do this again at a different point in my life. Like, and I want to. So like there was learning and interesting things that happened there, even if it wasn't euphoric and even if it wasn't just all positive.
And it isn't always all positive. There are, and I've talked about this on the podcast in my own experience. I mean, there are bad trips that are, and this is part of the discussion risk when I talk about risks of psychological nature. Bad trips are real and they're awful, right? Because they take on this sort of ontological dimension that can be truly terrifying. Feeling stuck in like infinite hell realms. And that sounds odd to say, but that's exactly what the experience is feeling like you've lost your bearings in reality and you don't know how to get out and you feel like you're stuck forever, which is why, another thing is, to stay grounded and, to be around other people who can help ground you, to have, your music, I think, can help ground people. Your senses, paying attention to your senses, and remembering, I took a drug and this is a drug experience and it will stop.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really important thing to remember, because for almost everyone, it does, right? Like there are those trips that go on, like those are, but those are extremely rare for almost everyone. This is a drug experience. I took a drug. It lasts a certain amount of time and it will stop. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and to keep in mind for people around you, to remind each other, and then like, hey, let's just, focus on this, this flower or this vase or whatever, and listen to this music and just kind of get really present with an experience and pass through. And, instead of, and I think this is actually a really interesting therapeutic aspect too, is that I think whatever therapeutic paradigm you ascribe to, something akin to acceptance is broadly viewed as a pretty helpful thing. Ability to accept experience, to not resist, to not fight against your own experience, to accept what is. And that's exactly the case in the psychedelic experience. Like, when you start to have a challenging experience, there's that real energy, and it can manifest really, really physically. Like you can like be trembling, and just like there's this resistance that you can physically feel as you resist and don't want to have an experience. So there might be a terrifying vision or something, just really, painful arising. And as you resist it, it gets worse. And as you accept and let go and allow your experience to unfold, most of the time it will open up. And that bad experience that you wanted so badly to avoid, like this is life, right? This bad experience that you so wanted to avoid, you let go and you move through it, and it's transient. And on the other side of that can be a whole array of different experiences. And then you can move through those with sort of grace, and things can transform and change completely. So there's this acceptance of just like, go with it, go with the experience, don't fight the experience, don't resist the experience, go with it, surrender to it to a degree. Like, instead of like, I don't want to feel this way, I don't want to see this, I don't like, just, I'm going to listen to music, I'm going to let this experience take me over, and it's going to pass through, and it's going to transform into something else, because life is change, constant change. We lock it into place when we resist it. As soon as we kind of like release that resistance, it can move and it'll become something else. And often that something else will be really beautiful or fun or interesting, or just the next thing that needs to be moved through.
Well, I say to a lot of my clients, it's, if you're this man on a surfboard in the ocean, you can either try to control the ocean or you can ride the wave. And if you try to control the ocean, it's not going to work out very well for you. And so, and all of these things, so that we can take, it sounds like for people take even from a bad trip, even from these experiences, saying like the way that we can sometimes get through that, we can then apply and generalize some of that back to our regular life, hopefully.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, like it's there's a lot of like acceptance practice, and you can actually get a really condensed sense of what it means and what it feels like to accept, and for it to move and for it to release. And it kind of creates like, I get it, I can see it, I can like, whereas I mean in day-to-day life you can accept I like, yes, acceptance is a really useful thing, but often it's just like again and again and again, and you just get that sort of almost, I don't know if I want to say, but maybe reinforcement, like during a trip of releasing, and I feel that release happen from your head to your toe. Oh, that's what it means to just like let something go. That's what that means. Just like whoosh, it's gone. Something else is there.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that still remains a big barrier for people being able to have these experiences is the law in a lot of states. And there are some states that
Yes.
are moving to open up more and more to allow people to, have psychedelic experiences and not be persecuted for that. So you're actually pretty involved in that in Illinois. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what's going on in Illinois and what's the current state of legality of psychedelics in Illinois?
Yeah, I would love to. So the I think this originated with the Illinois Psychedelic Society, which you can find, online, Illinois Psychedelic Society, or on a Facebook page, the Illinois Psychedelic Society Facebook page, and um, with a woman named Jean Lacey. I met her. She's down here in Chillicothe, so a lot of this effort has been, downstate, which is kind of fun and interesting for me. But it's been a process over a year long of working to develop this law. It was initially, we're working with Rep. LaShawn Ford. He up in the Chicago area. He was interested in this. We got involved with him. He's been really great and supportive and easy to work with. And we tried initially. It was like, well, let's do something like what they did in Oregon. But the beautiful thing is, Oregon passed their ballot initiative 2 years ago. And then they had this long process of an advisory board hashing out all kinds of challenges with just there's so many things to keep track of, and we got to learn from that. We got to watch their conversations and learn from what they were doing, and learn when we created and what we're trying to create. And there's basically two parts of it. One creates a facilitated use program, which means you can go to a psilocybin service center and you don't need to have a mental health diagnosis. Anybody could do this. They go to the mental health, they go to the psilocybin services center, and they would be able to have a facilitated experience with someone. And the process of we created the law will create an advisory board that's going to determine all the specific rules and who can do that, and the qualifications they need to have, and all kinds of stuff. But that's the gist of it, is that one part of it will create a psilocybin services program. The other part, and the part I feel really, really strongly about, is that it removes psilocybin from the list of controlled substances in Illinois. And also, I should add that this advisory board is also going to have the authority to then look at other substances and determine whether they warrant listing as they're listed now, and whether they would be appropriate to include in the psilocybin services program, and whether they would be their listing on as a controlled substances is warranted. So the advisory board would be able to kind of look at that and make recommendations about other substances as well. But it starts with psilocybin. The rollout is with psilocybin, and this would remove it from the list of controlled substances in Illinois. So it would not be a controlled substance any longer in Illinois. Of course, it will be still under federal law, but not in Illinois. And that means it would be you could grow it, you could consume it, you could give it away, and you can possess it. You wouldn't be able to sell it because it can still be regulated, much as like we regulate tobacco or alcohol. It can still be regulated in that way. It just wouldn't be regulated under the Controlled Substances Act in Illinois.
And so for people, and then so now that it's a bill, just kind of, we remember that School of Rock video, that before a bill to become a law, it has to get through the whole machinery of the politics in Springfield. So if people are interested, they could reach out to their state representative or whatnot, and to encourage them to push this forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, the first step would be to go to the Illinois Psychedelic Society. You can learn more there. There's fact sheets, and follow on Facebook. You can join, or you can join. And that's a great place to get more information. If you want to contribute time or energy or money, it's expensive to get a law through. And so tax deductible contributions can be made to the Illinois Psychedelic Society, or to not tax deductible, but you can. Inthio Illinois is another organization. It's kind of that we created to kind of specifically push for this bill, and you can donate to them too. Although that's not a tax deductible donation, but they also are. And I'm not just trying to fundraise here completely, but if you're moved to, by all means. But if you want to just learn more, go there, and then and reach out to your reps. And I think this is I think it's a great law for a lot of reasons. But I feel really strongly that I don't think it's a good approach to make a psilocybin services program that does not include robust um, justice measures to remove it from the Controlled Substances Act, because to have people going to jail at the same time, and it also implies that. And while I am a tremendous advocate for therapeutic use, I think we can using science and practice, we can really learn how to use these substances to help people. I don't think that's the only way that they should have to be used. Not everybody wants that kind of a trip. Not everybody wants that kind of experience. And I think people should be able to use them in other ways as well. I think, going to a concert is a fine thing to do, and it's that experience. It's actually really kind of amazing to me that a lot of people go to concerts and trip. A lot of people,
Mhm.
and they're huge events, and people generally go in and they go and they have a good time and they see this concert and they leave without incident. There's remarkably few incidents. If you did have incidents at concerts, they are probably much more likely to be related to alcohol than psychedelics. I mean, people can do that and enhance the experience, and people should be able to do that and not have to worry about being arrested. Um, and so I think that the bill really does, it needs to go hand in hand of a robust um, reform on the justice side, as well as providing, if people want a safe container with somebody whose job it is, who is well trained, who is credentialed, by the state to provide a safe experience, people can do that as well. So it gives people options, and sort of kind of takes it out of the out of the shadows as something that is shameful to do and dangerous illegally to do.
Well, and again, if people want to learn more about this, go to the sites that Nate recommended. But I also can say, if you're interested in this topic, I can't recommend enough following Nate's podcast, Altered States of Context, and the guests that they have on. I just always feel like I learn a ton about, and I think it's really, while you guys are advocates for it, I always feel like there's a well-balanced view of the pros and cons, the ethics of things. So I'd encourage you guys to check out that. And where can they find that? Is on Apple Podcast, or where are some good places for them to find you and your podcast?
I think anywhere that you listen to podcasts, it's not on YouTube, which maybe I should fix, because people, even though we don't have video, but I've seen a lot of people put podcasts on YouTube just with a graphic on the screen. We don't do that, but maybe I should. But anywhere else, Apple, Spotify, whatever little podcast app you like to use, it's probably there. I put it on hold. I think all of them that I could find. So shouldn't be hard to find. Altered States of Context, Brian Pilecki, Nathan Gates. And we've done 2 seasons, and we've recorded 5 interviews now for the 3rd season that we'll probably start releasing the 3rd season here in the spring. We'll take a few months off every year, because it's a lot to produce a podcast. So but we have some already in the can, ready, that'll be ready to go coming up.
Well, Nate, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, and it's been so fun catching up with you after 20-something years of,
Sure.
Nate knew me when I had hair. So anyway, but so again, listeners, if any of you have questions for me or for Mariska, remember to email us at daniel.magler@live.com. And until we speak again, do whatever it takes to get you through this world. But remember, you are not allowed to die.
Thanks.